Hello, I'm Tim Sparks. I'm going to attempt to record this, which is unusual technology for me. I'm going to try and do it without too many mistakes. I'm going to try and do it without too much background noise from cars or planes, and we'll hope we manage to get to the end of this with success. This work is some of my own work in collaboration with Lorian Whittle and Judith Garforth, who both work for the Woodland Trust on the Nature's Calendar scheme. What I'm going to spend some time talking about is a comparison of Gilbert White's records of the calendar of nature with more recent records, ones that have been collected over the last 20 years or so. Most of you will be familiar with Gilbert White's naturalist calendar. It's usually tucked away at the end of Natural History of Selborne, and it summarises the records kept by Gilbert White and those of William Marquig, who lived at Battle in Sussex. What many of you may not know is that this wasn't compiled by Gilbert White, it wasn't tabulated by Gilbert White, but was produced after his death. It wasn't in the very first editions of Natural History of Selborne, but appeared from about 1795 onwards. The more recent records that I'm going to focus on are those kept by the Woodland Trust as part of the Nature's Calendar scheme. It's a national scheme recording from a very large area, not just the area around where Gilbert White lived, but a much broader area, but we shall just focus on Gilbert White's local area. And this has now been running for 20 years or so. It's amassed quite a large number of records of phenology, the timing of the seasons, and it's added historical records into its database. My own interest in phenology started really with perhaps a rediscovery of the records of Robert Marsham. Some of you will be familiar with Robert Marsham because there was a correspondence over a few years between Robert Marsham and Gilbert White that started as a bit of mutual admiration, I suppose, when Gilbert White had published Natural History of Selborne and Robert Marsham had published his Indications of Spring in the Royal Society, and Gilbert White and Robert Marsham actually regretted that they never physically met and that their correspondence was all that could be expected of some old men at that point in history. So just as a brief summary then, we all know that Gilbert White was born 300 years ago. Between the years 1751 and about 1773, maybe slightly earlier, he kept a garden calendar where he kept some records of his activities in the garden and some activity and some records of flowering and so forth. From 1768, he kept a naturalist journal, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in a second. And he kept that right up to his death. And in 1789, as we all know, he published the Natural History of Selborne. This is a copy of one of the pages of Gilbert White's Naturalist Journal. It was a pre-printed book, I suppose. It was the sort of thing that you might have expected to buy in W.H. Smith, if W.H. Smith had existed back then. And it was the brainchild, I suppose, of Daines Barrington, who was a naturalist, another person that Gilbert White was in correspondence with. And it had columns for recording temperature at 8 o'clock, at 12 o'clock noon, at 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock afternoon. So we have temperature, pressure, barometer readings, wind speed or wind direction, rainfall and size of hailstones, weather, trees first in leaf, fungi first appearing, plants first in flower, mosses vegetating, birds and insects first appearing or disappearing, and observations with regard to fish and other animals, and then miscellaneous observations. And so for a period of approximately 26 years, Gilbert White kept entries in this, not always very consistently, as we'll see. And it's not always easy to be absolutely certain what he was recording. So down in the bottom right-hand corner of this particular one, you can see that he mentions that nightingale sings, that the wood owl hoots, and that the fern owl, which is the nightjar, chatters. Are these casual observations, or were they the very first observations for that particular year? I suppose we'll never absolutely know the answer to that. So this is an example of one edition of the Natural History of Selborne, and the calendars that are reported. You can see that there are separate columns for Gilbert White's records and those of William Markwick. And typically 2 dates are mentioned. So the very earliest date recorded and the very latest date recorded for both locations. And so the first line here has robin singing. Gilbert White first recorded it on January the 1st. His latest record was on January the 12th. Markwick recorded it between January the 3rd and 31st, and again in October. What we don't know, which is a bit disappointing, is that how many years that these records were taken for. We might think that it was for the full 26-year period from 1768 to 1793, but in fact that's unlikely to be so. And single entries such as that for the snail here, January the 2nd, are very likely to be the record of just 1 year. So we're not always certain when we compare White and Markwick's records whether we're comparing like for like. Were they recorded in the same years? And it's unlikely, I think, that the dates refer to the full 26-year period. I have an interest in the Gilbert White records because I have records, for example, of rhubarb. I have rhubarb records from 3 different countries, spanning about 200 years, but I have nothing from the 18th century, and it would be really interesting to compare right back to that. And that there are entries by Gilbert White. So this particular one says, cut the stalks of garden rhubarb to make tarts, but it's not clear. It's not clear from his records whether this is the very first harvest of rhubarb that year. If it is, it's very late, but again, this might just be a very casual observation. And this entry for the Red Admiral is quite an interesting one. He talks about it being an autumn insect, which it was, and this record of May the 13th, 1775 must be an accident. Red Admiral for a very long period was a migratory butterfly. In more recent times, we're used to it overwintering. We're used to it seeing it in spring, but back in the 18th century, this would have been very unusual. 1775 was a warm spring. It followed a very mild winter, possibly the mildest for about 15 or 20 years. So it's very likely that this was an overwintering specimen, an unusual overwintering specimen that he saw. The problem that we have when we look at the calendar of nature is this May the 13th record for the Red Admiral is actually listed in the diary in the calendar as if it were a typical date. So the person that compiled the calendar has ignored the fact that Gilbert White considered this to be very unusual and specified this. And in this case, we know that this is a single year. We know this is only 1 year, only one record. And when we've gone and made this comparison, we've ignored any events like the Red Admiral here, which appear to be based just on a single year of data. And unfortunately, the orange tip underneath it, which is such a good species to record in terms of first appearances in spring, also appears that it's likely to be just a single year entry. Walter Johnston, when back in the 1930s, when he wrote his book, The Journals of Gilbert White, he described the process by which this naturalist calendar came about. So John Aikin, who'd produced his own calendar a few years earlier, received the journals on Gilbert White's death, and Walter Johnston, I guess, is struggling to be polite. So he says here that Aikin somewhat carelessly extracted first occurrence records and published the calendar. And he placed those side by side with those of William Markwick. And we don't really know much more about William Markwick's records and how many years they were based on and so on. And on the very next page, Johnston goes on to say that these data were loosely compiled to form a naturalist calendar. So that's very faint praise or damning praise, perhaps. And then later on, in spite of this, and also because Aikin took considerable liberties with the text. So there's some quite heavy criticism here of the way that Aikin extracted data and wrote up the naturalist calendar. But despite this, this is such an interesting period of history. We'd dearly love to be able to make that comparison between Gilbert White's records and the more recent ones. Before I go any further, I just want to show you the spring temperatures in the period that Gilbert White was recording. And you can see there's a great fluctuation. So in 1770, spring temperature averaged about 6 degrees Celsius. And in 1775, the year that we had the record of the butterfly, you can see it was about 9.5 degrees, so very much warmer, and approaching 10 degrees in 1779. But so there's a fluctuation of about 4 degrees, and this would very likely lead to huge differences in the timing of events over that period. We know that it's typical for there to be differences of 1, 2, or even 3 months between the events recorded at the same location in different years, depending on what the weather is of those particular years. So when we only have a single record recorded by Gilbert White, unless we know which year it came from, unless we can make some sort of correction for the temperature of that particular year, it's very difficult to make direct comparison. Are we, for example, comparing a record of White's from 1770, this very cold year, possibly with one from Markwick with a very warm year, perhaps here in 1779. The average temperature of this period, of this springs in this period, was about 8 degrees Celsius, and it would be nice if the calendar actually represented typical flowering of that period of history. So in the time that I've got left, I'm going to do a very broad brush comparison between White and Markwick's records with records that have been collected from Hampshire, from Surrey, from both West and East Sussex in 2 different periods. There's the period from 1891 to 1947, when the Royal Meteorological Society ran a national recording scheme. That actually started slightly earlier in the 1870s after several decades of deliberation, and ended in 1947. Sadly, it would have been a huge resource had it continued to the current time, as it has in several other European countries. Over the last 20 years or so, there has been a national network recording phenology coordinated by the Woodland Trust and called Nature's Calendar. And for these three periods, I've just summarized here the temperatures. So the black dots and the black line represent the temperatures for the average temperatures for the period that Gilbert White was recording his calendar entries, 1768 to 1793. And then with the open circles are the average temperatures in the years 1891 to 1947, when the Royal Meteorological Society scheme was active. And you can see that it's very close. It's slightly warmer, perhaps in the very beginning of the year. In January, for example, it looks particularly warm, and possibly December. And finally, there's the last 20 years that we have data from nature's calendar, and represented here by the grey dots. And you can see that in every single calendar month, the mean temperature in that period has been higher than it was during Gilbert White's recording period. Now, you may think these are only small differences, but just as an example, a 1 degree difference is about what you'd expect between the mean temperature in Newcastle upon Tyne and in Hunstanton. So 1 degree does represent the equivalent of quite a big shift in latitude, for example. This is quite a complex graph, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one. Gilbert White recorded first flowering of horse chestnut between May the 21st and June the 9th. Now, for purposes of analysis, we usually convert these to days of the year, and May the 21st is day 141 and June the 9th is day 160. So they're represented on this vertical axis by these grey lines at 141 and 160. So between the grey lines are where is the time when Gilbert White recorded flowering of horse chestnut. During the Royal Meteorological Society scheme, 1891 to 1947, we have about 1,000 records of horse chestnut flowering. This box plot here shows the spread of dates from sort of late 90s, which is early in April, up to about 150, which is the end of May. And these box plots are represented so that half the data lie below this horizontal line within the box. This is the median. So a quarter of our records are between the bottom of the whisker and the bottom of the box. Another quarter of the records up to the center line of the box. Another quarter of the records to the top of the box. And finally, the last quarter of the records go towards the top whisker. So the blue box represents the core of dates that were recorded on it, represents the middle 50% of all records. And you can see that the top whisker does overlap into Gilbert White's period, but not by very much at all. So by perhaps a little over 100 years after Gilbert White's death, horse chestnut flowering seemed to be substantially earlier. For the more recent period, the same applies, except that this is based on about 1,900 records. Again, a quarter of the records to the bottom of the box, a quarter, the next quarter to the middle of the center line of the box, next quarter to the top of the box, and the final quarter to the top. And this time there is very little overlap. The box itself has dropped lower than the previous one, probably by something approaching 10 days or so. So what this would seem to suggest is that compared to Gilbert White's horse chestnut flowering period, which is between these two horizontal lines, the Royal Meteorological Society scheme was considerably earlier, and the more recent scheme, Nature's Calendar, even earlier than that. It's a very simple story. It does reflect the changes in temperature between the periods, and I should perhaps just emphasize that this picture is for identification purposes only. We record the first flowering, which is when the first few florets are open, rather than this full flower as shown here. We can extend this to comparison to a number of other events on the same basis, where the horizontal broad lines represent the dates on which Gilbert White recorded the earliest and the latest, and these blue boxes represent the Royal Meteorological Society scheme on the left and the Nature's Calendar scheme on the right hand side. So for coltsfoot flowering, which I'll come back to in a minute, it looks like the Royal Meteorological Society scheme was on a par with Gilbert White, and more recently it's got later. Wood anemone seems to be tucked nicely in there. Swallow, if anything, first swallow getting later. Ditto, apologies. Ditto, the first cuckoo. On the other hand, blackthorn flowering has got considerably earlier. Hawthorn flower is trending towards being earlier. Ivy flowering, which is an autumn event, may be getting earlier. And the last swallow, well, seems to be an earlier departure of swallow. This is a rather complicated summary of 4 of those events, 4 flowering events for coltsfoot, for hawthorn, for horse chestnut, and for elder. And I'll just look at the horse chestnut one first, because that's the one that we looked at earlier. The mean of Gilbert White's earliest and latest dates is May 30th. Markwick's, on the other hand, is 17 days earlier than that, which is quite unusual. And the Royal Meteorological Society scheme, 1891 to 1947, and the Nature's Calendar scheme, 1999 to 2018, we've looked at in 2 different ways. We've looked at just averaging all, in this case, the 1018 records held in this period for the 4 counties that I mentioned earlier, and the mean date would be May the 4th. And if we look at a similar thing for the 1920 records of the Nature's Calendar, the mean date would be April the 27th. If we, instead of just broadly taking every single record, we calculate annual means and then average them, the 55 years of records for horse chestnut give us a mean date of May the 5th, which is very similar to May the 4th. And the 20 years of Nature's Calendar gives us a date of April the 27th. So again, very similar. But the overarching pattern here is that events, as we've already seen, for the Royal Meteorological Society scheme were earlier than Gilbert White's, and even earlier in recent time. Markwick's records, certainly for hawthorn, horse chestnut, and elder, seem to be earlier, and in each of those cases the current record is much earlier still. The exception to this is coltsfoot, which is an unusual one. Markwick's records are a bit later. The Royal Meteorological Society scheme, March the 4th, is very similar to White, but current records seem to be later. Now, coltsfoot is a bit of a bête noire for myself. I'm struggling to fully understand why it appears to be flowering later when every indication should be that it's earlier. And I believe, but I've got no great evidence to back this up, is because it has become quite a rare species. It was a very, very common agricultural weed that spread typically by breaking up the root fragments, and so you'd find it on ploughed land and building sites and all sorts of things like that. I have to make a distinct effort to find it now. I have to go to where I think there'll be disturbed ground on sort of estate development sites or on ditches that have been dug out, and I do find difficulty finding it in the spring, and I wonder whether the apparently later date there is because we've had difficulty in finding it. If we compare everything, if we compare all the records that we think are compatible with Gilbert White with the current scheme, so on the x-axis here, we've got the mean date recorded by or on behalf of Gilbert White. Day 91 is the beginning of April, day 151 is the end of May, and you can see that in that period there's a fairly big chunk of species here which are earlier because they're below the horizontal dotted red line in the middle. Most of these are plants. They're represented by this this double symbol here, and they've broadly got earlier. So in this period of April and May, it looks like events broadly got earlier. Well, the plant records have. In terms of bird records, there's quite a number of migrant bird species which are appearing to be later now. Possibly this is to do with rarity again, or just our ability to observe migrant bird species in a much more urban environment that we all live in now. And there are some events early in the year which are a bit inconclusive, but certainly in that period of April and May, it does look like plant records at least have got or are considerably earlier than those recorded by Gilbert White. So I'm very conscious of the time and that I've probably been speaking for too long. So my broad conclusions here are to emphasize that recent temperatures have been much greater in recent time than in the period 1768 to 1793 when Gilbert White was keeping his naturalist journal. That many spring plant events now appear to be earlier than those recorded by Gilbert White, but that's not necessarily true of the bird events for the migrant arrivals, for example. I am tempted to temper all of this with a certain amount of caution because it's not completely clear to us whether all of the events that have been compiled by Aiken actually refer to first events, which is what are currently being recorded. And I do wonder that now that we're in White's tercentenary, whether this is the appropriate time for a reassessment of that calendar. Is it time to go back to the original records, to try and extract them, to try and make that comparison with Markwick on a like-for-like basis? So we're not comparing White's records from a warm year with Markwick's records from a cold year, for example, that we are trying to match up events for the same period and to give us a bit more certainty about exactly what those dates in White's calendar actually represent. This is no criticism. This is not intended as a criticism of Gilbert White himself. If there is any criticism, rather like Johnston, it's directed at Aiken, who extracted data somewhat carelessly, to use Johnston's words, from the journals and then published them. It would be lovely if we could maybe just do a modification of that calendar so that a comparison with modern records would be much more straightforward. So that's the end of my presentation. I thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'll do my utmost to answer them. Thank you.